Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Simone, and I'm Community Manager with the OED team, and I'll be hosting the session today. I'm delighted to be here today with Dr. Catherine Sangster and Dr. Matthew Morland, who will be presenting the OED's British and U.S. pronunciation models to us. Dr. Catherine Sangster is the Oxford Languages Executive Editor for Pronunciations at Oxford University Press, and Dr. Matthew Morland is a freelance pronunciation editor for Oxford Languages and also a phonetics lecturer at the University of East Anglia. And now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Sangster and Dr. Morland so they can begin. So, Catherine, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Simone, and thank you everybody for joining our webinar today. I'm going to start by just talking through the agenda for the presentation today, and then Matthew and I will go on to discuss the evolution and the scope of OED's pronunciation models. And the plan is for us to, as much as we can, to look at the history, look at their current state, and then think a little bit about some possible future directions too. The Oxford English Dictionary has given transcriptions for British English pronunciations since its inception in the late 19th century, and then US English pronunciations followed at the end of the 20th century. In the 21st century, specifically since 2015, these pronunciation transcriptions have been complemented by audio, which allows users to hear the pronunciation spoken aloud alongside the written form, but the written form remains fundamental. Something else that's happened in the 21st century is that our pronunciation coverage has expanded to include world Englishes, but those are not the focus of our discussion today. I just wanted to mention them anyway. So today, we're going to cover how many pronunciations OED has and where they can be found within the dictionary text, why we give pronunciations at all, what's the historical background to doing that, what's our current remit, what principles do we follow, and what are our sources. And here we will say a little bit about our audio pronunciations too. And then in the next part of the webinar, we're going to dig a little bit more into the specific detail of our models for the transcription of British and US English. So what they're based on, how we use them, and how much variation they can encompass. And finally, as I say, with a little time at the end, I'll talk briefly about some recent innovations and some future directions. And then we should have plenty of time for questions. And I'm going to say now, Matthew has made a collection of pronunciation trivia to entertain us. So I'm hoping we'll have time for that at the end in the question session too. Before we carry on, there's one more thing I wanted to say, which is that we've prepared this webinar with an academic audience in mind, or a research-focused audience in mind, but it should be accessible, I hope, to anybody with an interest in lexicography or in pronunciation. If we use any terminology that you don't understand or any concepts that don't make sense, please do ask about them in the questions, and we'll follow up either in the spoken question session or afterwards. Okay, so I'm going to pass over to Matthew now to give us an idea first of the scale of the thing. Here's Matthew.
Hello, everyone. So before we get into the detail of the pronunciation models, it's worth just outlining the scale of the OED's pronunciations. It's a constantly changing number as edits are made on a daily basis. So this is from a snapshot we took last month. We had just under 510,000 individual transcribed pronunciations. That's every separate pronunciation wherever it occurs, except for the etymology sections for reasons that we'll explain. Aside from our 10,000 World English pronunciations, the rest are British and US English, and much of the difference between the British and US is accounted for by the 62,000 in entries still to be revised into the latest format. For those, we only have a British pronunciation, so as our revision progresses, the US pronunciations will increase quite substantially. Within a given entry, pronunciations can be found in a number of different places. More than 85% are exactly where you'd expect, in the dedicated pronunciation section immediately beneath the headword. But around 2,500 are given in the inflections, which for OED is only for some of the irregular inflections. An example we've reviewed recently was at follis, which is a bronze or copper coin, and that's a borrowing from Latin for which the plural that we give is folles. A smaller but growing number of pronunciations are those given in the variant form sections. These variant form pronunciations are inserted where there's a pronunciation associated with a current but particular variant spelling of an entry's headword. These can be very simple one-letter variants, so the resinous substance alban sometimes has a final E and is pronounced albane. Others are a little more different, such as the example you can see on the screen of the fisher martin called a weejack or a woodcock, which is both spelt and pronounced quite differently. But more than 13% of OED's pronunciations are found further down the entry, usually where an entry has a number of entries nested within it. And this particularly applies where we have affixes or combining forms. OED's approach to entries such as the prefix hypo is to give the pronunciations of its nested sub-entries, such as hypoactivity, hypoxia, hypoeutectoid, and also included in those 68,000 are just the occasional pronunciations that we attach to specific senses. But over time, we're moving these up to the top where we can explain more clearly which pronunciations span which senses. But let's just consider the history. So pronunciations are not a recent addition to the OED. Transcribed pronunciations were a feature of a New English Dictionary on Historical Principles that we know more colloquially as NED, known from the 1890s onwards as the first edition of the OED. The dictionary, as it began to be published under James Murray, slightly predated the International Phonetic Alphabet, but modern phoneticians will notice a number of similarities in the transcription systems. One of these is the explicit idea of one symbol for each simple sound. Ned's approach was not to use a respell system that was reliant on English letters, but the majority are Roman letters with historical values. So the consonants in particular share quite a few similarities with the IPA. You can explore the Ned pronunciations on the OED website at the link shown. You'll see differences, such as the voiceless dental fricative, the sound, being represented by the symbol thorn rather than theta, as in the IPA. But you'll see similarities, such as sh being the symbol esh and ng being the symbol eng. The vowels were in three groups in Ned, called ordinary, long, and obscure. Many of the symbols were really quite different, such as the symbol for the strut vowel and macrons indicating long vowels. But there was the turned E schwa symbol, and while many of the diphthongs, such as I and ow, didn't necessarily use the same symbols as we'd use now, they were similarly represented by two symbols, just as with the affricate consonants. Ned represented some specific non-English or historical speech sounds too, and primary stress was indicated by a turned period after the vowel in the stressed syllable, and subordinate stress having a colon-like double dot, which is quite different from how we represent stress today. Let's think about the purpose though. Well, Murray viewed transcriptions and transcribed pronunciations as essential, since they sought to represent, and quoting here from Murray, the actual living form or forms of a word, that is, the word itself, of which the current spelling is only a symbolization. Ever since then, pronunciations have retained a special status in the OED, such that the aim is not to try and encompass an evolution of pronunciations, nor is it to prescribe pronunciations that are faithful to entries' etymologies, but to give the current form or forms of each living word, or as Murray puts it, the latest fact in the form history of the word. So OED pronunciations reflect how language is, first and foremost, spoken, just as a child doesn't wait until they're literate before they master their first words. And yet, at the same time, we have the existence of spelling pronunciations and new words sometimes being formed on the basis of their orthography. And this leads to challenges, such as those that Murray goes on to describe. He writes, On several occasions, the editor has applied directly to the introducer of a word to know how he pronounces it or means it to be pronounced, and has received the answer that he has never thought of its pronunciation, does not presume to say how it ought to be pronounced, and leaves it to people to pronounce as they like, or to the dictionary to say what is the right pronunciation. This, of course, reverses the natural order of language in which speech comes first, and writing is only its symbolization. Well, back in the 21st century, there remain situations such as these, and the advent of digital social media has, if anything, intensified these orthographic coinages. Yet very quickly, a birthed written form becomes articulated by others, if not by the introducer themselves. And the goal of OED's pronunciations is to reflect a pronunciation that is representative of modern users of each word. And on that point, our former chief editor, John Simpson, summarized Ned's variety as a contemporary educated Southern English pronunciation. And as we'll come on to, this is still largely the starting point, but we're now afforded considerable flexibility to reflect variation where more than one pronunciation is current and sufficiently widespread.
Okay, thank you. So back to me for a little bit more of a romp through the history of the OED. So Matthew summarised what was going on in NED in the first edition, and I love to hear Murray's attitude towards the pronunciation and how important a part of the dictionary it was right from the start. So that first edition, that was published in fascicles between the 1880s and the 1920s, and then there was a supplement in 1933, and then 4 more supplements in the 70s and 80s. Then the process of modernising and computerising the OED began, which culminated in the publication of the second edition in 1989, and there was also a CD-ROM in 1992. This consisted of the original OED and the supplementary volumes, plus 5,000 completely new entries. And for the pronunciation transcriptions, this meant converting Murray's notation to the system, which did now use the symbols of the International Phonetic Alphabet. So as Matthew mentioned just now, for instance, the examples on the slide, Murray used a Y-like symbol for the sound y, and then in the second edition, moved to the IPA symbol that looks like a lowercase j. Murray's choice of a thorn moved to the IPA's choice of the theta for the sound th, and so forth. And then the next step, the work that started at the turn of the century and is still continuing, is the creation of a fully revised OED online, the third edition. The pronunciation transcription systems had another less radical but still significant reformulation in terms of the new model of British English or received pronunciation as devised by Professor Clive Upton of the University of Leeds. Another change that came along with the third edition was the introduction of US pronunciations alongside the British ones. The British English transcriptions are supplemented by a standard US pronunciation based on a model devised by Professor William Kretschmar of the University of Georgia. These two models are set out in the Oxford Dictionary of Pronunciation for Current English, published in 2001, of which Upton and Kretschmar were the editors. And we're going to go into the detail of those models as they're applied in OED later on in the talk. We do continue to introduce minor refinements as the dictionary evolves. Since we don't set out to trace the pronunciation developments of each entry in great detail, but we want to provide current pronunciations. So as Matthew was saying, Murray's latest fact, we don't note everything, but we do comment on places where there's a significant change between editions. So if a new pronunciation has completely taken over, the pronunciation that NED gave has fallen away, then there are some editorial comments. So on the next couple of slides, I've got some examples showing you the evolution of the pronunciations from NED to the present day. So here is mighty. So NED transcribed it as you see there with the brackets, and you can see that the diphthong I is transcribed with those particular symbols, the turned E and the dotted I, that the vowel at the end is again represented with a dotted I. and the stress is indicated with that dot in the middle after the stress syllable. Whereas the second edition, when the IPA conventions come in, the stress is indicated with the mark at the start of the stress syllable. The A and dotless I used to symbolize the diphthong. And here there's a less tense symbol chosen for the happy I at the end. Then by the time we get to the third edition, many things remaining the same, but note that the transcription of the diphthong I has changed to use the inverted V symbol. This was one of the innovations, the Upton innovations, and the dotted I at the end. And then the other thing that we see is with the US one, the flapped or tapped T, as in a pronunciation like mighty, is represented with the D symbol. And in this example, this is the word zoophile or zoophile. So you can see at the top, that's what an entry would look like. That's what all of the entries look like. You've got the two variants for British, two variants for US, the little blue arrows, which are what you would click to hear them spoken aloud. And the note down at the bottom, which is the reason this one is here for you to look at, is, I'm going to make it bigger and go. So NED gave a different pronunciation, zoophil, and what you can see here is the NED's way of transcribing it is there first, and then it's given an IPA gloss to hopefully make it as accessible as possible to the users. Okay, back to you, Matthew.
Thank you, Catherine. So let's just think a little bit about where the OED's current remit lies as far as pronunciations go. Well, in many ways, as Catherine said, we still keep to Murray's idea of presenting the living form or forms of a word. Hence, the priority is given to presenting current pronunciations of words still in current use. If an entry is tagged as obsolete, then it's unlikely that you'll find a pronunciation with it. This idea of giving accurate current pronunciations is key. We're not aiming to give an exhaustive historical pronunciation record, though as Catherine has shown, where we do identify significant differences, we do consider notes within the entry. Perhaps one of the most misunderstood features of OED's pronunciations, and indeed OED more generally, is that we are descriptivist in our approach rather than prescriptivist. We look for what people are actually doing in their use of a word, rather than trying to dictate what history or morphology would expect. Murray himself had been alluding to this, while Daniel Jones, writing in an English pronouncing dictionary, summarized this perspective particularly well, when he wrote that the proper function of the phonetician is to observe and record accurately, to be, in fact, a kind of living phonograph. Well, we'll summarize our range of pronunciation sources in just a moment, but I also want to make clear that we're not overstating this. We don't ignore etymology or morphology. They can give us a really useful starting point, and there are common patterns to how loans from particular languages are anglicized over time. But if we're able to establish that current speakers are not pronouncing a word as we'd expect, OED will reflect that current pronunciation. In order to do this, we need to look at a whole range of different reliable sources that reflect the current pronunciation of knowledgeable speakers, though we do cast quite a wide net with that where we can. With the increasing ability to search online audio and video for evidence of words in natural use, one of the key questions is whether the speakers we're hearing are knowledgeable of the topic. Hearing online chemistry lectures from researchers using the name of a chemical they work with, that's one thing, but a video of a consumer who's listing the ingredients in a product they've bought is far more likely to be giving a spelling pronunciation that may not be appropriately reflective of how a chemistry tagged term is pronounced. So each instance is evaluated and weighted on its merits, including the extent to which a word might be used by people from outside of the discipline. So on that point, let's consider some of the sources that we use more broadly. We do consider subject specialists directly, and we do consult them directly, and they are one of many sources that we have available. We have access to a wide range of trusted dictionaries and surveys of English, going back from over 100 years ago right through to the present day. So pronouncing dictionaries, general dictionaries, both modern and historical, dialect and variety specific dictionaries, even foreign language dictionaries if it's a recent loan, so we can consider the likely anglicisation. Specialist dictionaries, and the etymologies, of course, can give us a useful starting point. We may also look at similar words for analogies, either from a similar root or with a common morpheme. And as I've mentioned, we do make considerable use of natural audio and video evidence. We look at television and radio programs, news sites, speeches and lectures such as TED Talks. Online video platforms such as YouTube are all part of our resources that we are regularly consulting. And sometimes, of course, we do make use of experts in the field. Some will be consulted about the entry more generally as part of its revision process, and will make a comment on the pronunciation. And others we go fishing to hear knowledgeable speakers who are likely to use a word naturally. One of my favourite examples from for the last few years was with powan, which is a freshwater whitefish found in Loch Lomond and Loch Eck in Scotland. So to check exactly whether the Scottish English pronunciation was powan or powan, we called the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park and had a discussion with them. The entry itself, though, can also give kind of a bit of a steer towards its pronunciation. So we do study the variant spellings in our bibliographical sources. Of course, we consult the etymologies, and just very occasionally, with a very big pinch of salt, the use in rhymes and other poetic uses might just give us some clues. Let's just return to that broader remit then. There are two additional points just to mention here. The first is that we are seeking to represent appropriate variation. Now, some of this is fairly systematic, such as coalesced and non-coalesced forms of tune, tune. But some variation is from establishing that there's a lack of agreement within the field of users for a specific lexical item. But the final point about our remit is a very recent addition. Catherine's already alluded to this addition of audio recordings is influencing the evolution of OED pronunciations. It raises for us an interesting dichotomy. From a dictionary publishing perspective, we want to visually condense the variants we give in order to keep the pronunciation sections concise. So we might use bracketed sounds or ways of showing multiple stress patterns. But from an audio perspective, condensed pronunciations require making big decisions about how we record them, as the recording can inevitably only represent one of the condensed options. So the provision of audio in OED is subtly altering how we manage the pronunciations themselves. On our next slide, you can see that actually just a little glimpse into what the audio is like for us. It's been a huge addition to the OED. As of April 2020, there were 460,000 audio files used in the OED. And those of you with a good memory for the 510,000 transcriptions I mentioned, that's mainly down to homonyms and homophones, that difference. So we do have the same audio, for example, attached to the different entries of bank, and the British audio at ORE or is the same as the British audio at AWE or. The recording is all done in-house by our phonetically trained pronunciation data architect, Gary Lester, and we use phonetically trained native speakers in a professional sound booth. We've had 13 different British English speakers and 7 US English speakers, plus either 1 or 2 for each of our world Englishes. These recordings form part of a vast pool of 883,000 audio files, though just under 150,000 are sentences, which are used fairly exclusively by the Advanced Learners Dictionary at the moment. Now, this is called the sound bank, and the files are used across several OUP dictionaries. The sound bank was started for the Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary in 2007. In 2012, started specifically adding the pronunciations, the extra pronunciations required for the OED, and that's how I came to be involved with OUP and the OED. These went live online at the end of 2015, and work continued so that around 2 years ago, early 2018, we were largely up to date. And now we focus on the recordings needed for the continuing additions and edits, with some of the early audio now being refreshed as well. Well, before I hand back to Catherine to introduce our British and American English models, let's just talk briefly about the principles. The principles that underpin our pronunciations are actually relatively straightforward. We give largely phonemic transcriptions concerned with the meaningfully contrastive sounds of each variety. Each symbol, each phoneme represents a range of potential precise articulations. So, for example, a T symbol in a transcription could, depending on the context or speaker factors, be fully or partially aspirated, be reinforced with a glottal stop, be realized as a glottal stop, have a lateral release, a nasal release, no audible release, and so on. We don't specify which of those allophones is feasible in each case, but inevitably the audio will represent one feasible realization of each of those individual phonemes. But that does explain why the audio will never replace the transcriptions. The transcriptions themselves encompass a far wider range of possibilities than the audio could possibly reflect. I say these are largely phonemic transcriptions because we do reflect some phonetic details that would be notable by their absence. For example, the tapped flapped T in US English. And features such as yod coalescence could be implied by rule, but we give both coalesced and non-coalesced forms, as with the tune example. Consonant symbols are largely those of the IPA, with the only significant departure being the tapped flapped T as D, which we will come on to. The vowels in general are English phonemic values. But as we'll see, the approach adopted by the third edition of OED does allow us to demonstrate important but subtle quality differences between vowels in different varieties. And that starts with, for example, the difference between the British A and the US ash trap vowels. But as we've expanded our coverage of World Englishes, we've been able to represent further qualities. On the web page that introduces our models, we have this vowel quadrilateral that you can see on the screen, which shows the approximate mappings of the monophthongs, with the typically rounded vowel qualities in red and the typically unrounded ones in blue. So on that note, I'm going to hand back to Catherine to talk about the British English model.
Thank you. So in this next part, the detail of some of the models, and for each one, what we'll do is I'm going to give an overview for a couple of minutes, and then Matthew's going to get down into some of the detail. So as we've said, the third edition of the OED transcribes British English according to the model of received pronunciation developed by Clive Upton for Oxford dictionaries in the 1990s. The very term received pronunciation, and I've left it in scare quotes there on the slide, is really very much debated. A lot of linguists argue that it's outdated. It reflects the prestigious standard of the social and economic elite. It's a socially acceptable or received form based on the speech of privately educated men and their families. I mean, that goes back, we keep calling back to Daniel Jones 100 years ago. Public school pronunciation was the term that he used. In attempts to steer towards a broader and more contemporary concept, free of the more offensive or objectionable connotations of RP, a lot of alternative names have been proposed by sociolinguists. Modern received pronunciation, Standard Southern British English or SSBE, BBC English, non-regional pronunciation, general British. These are all characterized by an absence of specifically regional accent features. There might be a locus of speakers in the southeast of England, but you can find it in smaller numbers across Great Britain, including in Wales and Scotland. That offers some justification for us calling our variety British English rather than English English. Incidentally, our World English models include models for Welsh English, Scottish English, and Manx English. So that's going on as well. But an alternative to finding another name for RP is to view it as a more flexible concept, which evolves with societal views of standard or regionally neutral forms. And Upton's view of RP was very much this, following the lead of A.C. Gimson in looking to a redefined RP, a diluted RP, which is not quite so narrow in its geographical and social representation. And Upton's description of vowel qualities reflects the symbols he adopted for OED and for the pronunciation that he edited with Bill Kretschmar. For an OED user to appreciate the variety being described by our British English pronunciation model, I want to make a couple of things clear. Firstly, the form of RP we described is still an accent. It is one variety of English pronunciation. We're not trying to put an umbrella over every possible British pronunciation. Regionally, yes, there is this prevalence in southeast England, but it's found across Great Britain, and it's not immediately going to locate a speaker with a specific geographical location. And the inclusion of systematic variants, for instance, our model includes Bath as well as Bath, and not only because that's the way I say it myself, they are partly reflective of regional influence on the variety as a whole. So RP speakers might vary in this respect, and there probably would be tendencies for those from certain geographical routes to prefer one variant over another. But we cover that by having an RP which isn't exclusively Southern British. Perhaps the most important thing that I want to make clear is that we're not concerned with prescribing correctness. It's not an intentionally prestigious variety, but, and I'm quoting Upton here, it's that accent which will be most widely acceptable as well as most intelligible to native British English speakers, and to which the speech of very many of them will in turn approximate closely. So both in the model and in the range of variants that we provide, we are trying to hold to the same principles as Daniel Jones 100 years ago. And I'm going to quote him one more time. He said, "I should like here to state I have no intention of becoming either a reformer of pronunciation or a judge who decides what pronunciations are good and what are bad. The proper yes, I won't repeat the living phonograph thing, but he adds at the end of this quote that I am not one of those who believe in the desirability or feasibility of setting up any one form as a standard for the English-speaking world." And the broadness of the model echoes this. The criterion for inclusion is what is heard to be used by educated, non-regionally marked speakers rather than what a preconceived model allows. The last thing I want to say is that the transcriptions are phonological or phonemic rather than phonetic. So although the adopted symbols for each sound attempt to reflect something of their articulatory nature in correspondence with the International Phonetic Alphabet, they are phonemes, and so we're looking at the minimally contrastive speech sounds. And I'm reiterating some of what Matthew said there, but so just to say one more time, they are an individual's pronunciation, one possible way of realizing that string. Now I'm going to let Matthew go into some of the detail now. There you are.
Thank you, Catherine. So if we had unlimited time, we could get really into the nuts and bolts of the British English model, but I'm just going to highlight a few of the key features. So you may notice that the dress and trap type vowels, we are using here the widely accepted in sociolinguistics, the keywords, the vowel keywords. So these are representing words that have similar vowel qualities. So words such as dress and trap reflect a general lowering over the years of RP's short front vowels, while words such as those with Bath, as Catherine's already mentioned, will have 2 British pronunciations. Same for the cure combination. Cloth entries, such as the words cross and soft, which were perhaps more traditionally, more historically, or in quality, are now being represented with the o quality. The broader mid-central quality of a lengthened schwa is the one that is chosen for nurse, and we show the tendency for square to nowadays be a tense monophthong rather than a diphthong. The starting quality of price is another one that often draws people's attention because it's different from quite a few other transcription schemes, but it's because it begins that vowel with a fairly central quality, and that's reflected with the turned V diphthongal constituent. Now, supplementing the strong vowels are a range of weak vowel qualities, which in the table on your screen is the rightmost column. Word final happy is shown as a lowercase I, though in non-utterance final flowing speech, there may be a less close and front quality to this. So this is covered by the use of the small capital I in cases such as Betty Crocker. And also worth noting here is how Upton and Kretschmar's novel approach to the vowel qualities that span I and and spanning and enable us to use these symbols of barred I and barred and that's quite a useful way of representing kind of a nice bit of variation just within one symbol. Not included in the table are the 2 accepted nasalized vowels in the British English model. So we have a as in coq au vin and en as in bouillon. Nasalized vowels, though, are exclusively found within loan words that have not become fully naturalized in English, but where some anglicization is evident, and it's very much apparent that speakers are not code switching. Consonant-wise, we have 26 consonants in our base set, and this includes the 2 affricates, ch and j, the voiceless velar fricative ch, and the lateral alveolar fricative ch. And those latter 2 are the ones that are routinely accepted in otherwise anglicized loans, particularly from the Scottish, Irish, and Welsh varieties. Now, we are representing a non-rhotic variety, so r does not pattern as it does in, say, US English. Coalescence, I've indicated already, but that is represented by the inclusion of both forms. So traduce, for example, has both traduce and traduce as options. The historical ly and sy syllable onsets, such as those in lucid and suit, are increasingly without the yod in RP, and for this reason are either bracketed or presented as separate variants for the benefit of the audio. Segments that are frequently elided in natural speech, so the ones that are normally dropped by many speakers, such as the T sound in softness, and certainly the linking R is routinely included, but the so-called intrusive R, like the commonly elided segments, is bracketed. Now, this difference between linking and intrusive R means that, for example, pouring, if it's spelt P-A-W-I-N-G, so to scrape at something with your paws, that has a bracketed R, but pouring spelt P-O-U-R-I-N-G has an unbracketed R. Other forms of assimilation that we represent are much more limited. They are often predictable by rule. And one form of assimilation, though, that is explicitly recognized is the possibility that the n sound in words such as ungrazed may be an alveolar or a velar nasal. And what makes the difference to us there is when we look at stress and we look at the salience of morpheme boundaries to determine which variant or variants to give. Syllabic consonants are extremely common in RP. OED indicates these with a combining syllabic marker beneath the sound, but unlike many places, we don't show this if the only logical English articulation would be to syllabify such a consonant. So if you look at our transcription of little, for example, you don't see a syllabic marker underneath that final L. Polysyllabic entries are described with one primary stress, except for a few interjections, which may have multiple primary stresses. Secondary stresses are certainly less frequently marked than in US English. Adjectives are given their non-contrastive predicative stress pattern rather than with contrast or attributive stress shift. So a word like overpaid will be given with the stress as in the manager was overpaid, not with the stress on the first syllable as in the overpaid manager. Catherine.
Thank you. I was just making sure I was unmuted. Okay. So then, now to the US model. And the principles underpinning these are, as we said, Bill Kretschmars, who worked with Upton as the co-editor of that Oxford Dictionary of Pronunciation for Current English. He was also consulted on many OED entries, and he wrote the description of standard American English in the Varieties of English series, which is a very useful source for us as a reference point for many of our world Englishes, not just this one. That pronunciation dictionary, that continues to be an important written source for US English, along with the US pronunciations that we have in the pronouncing dictionaries of John Wells and Jones et al., the Cambridge and the Longman, and of course several American sources such as Merriam-Webster. A generally agreed standard for spoken US English doesn't exist in quite the same way as received pronunciation does for British English. There is the term General American, but Kretschmar viewed this as an erroneous term, with educationally determined standards of pronunciation varying considerably between different regions of the United States of America. However, he observes the trend among younger educated speakers towards the suppression of strongly regionally marked forms in more formal contexts, and that's really what the US model focuses on. So to quote him, standard American English can best be characterized as what is left over after speakers suppress the regional and social features that have risen to salience and become noticeable. Salience in this respect is quite subjective and variable a thing, results in, again, quoting again, a linguistic continuum for American English in which no region or social group has pride of place, although he makes a key exception regarding the English of the American South. There are certain small ways in which the OED's US English model has evolved, influenced by the lexicographical demands and the remit of the OED, as Matthew has set out earlier, and also by the nature of the natural language evidence that we're now much more able to access as editors, especially in relation to some of the really low frequency or the really specialist terms. So once again, back to Matthew for some detail.
Thanks, Catherine. So again, there is much more detail if you want to follow this up in the online description of our model, but let's take a look at some of the key features. So we demonstrate the rhoticity of US English with R following a vowel rather than with the IPA's rhoticity diacritic. The historical R sets of lot and palm, I'm going to spare you all my very poor attempt at an American accent with some of these examples. They only have R, whereas the historical or sets in cloth and thought are given both or and R pronunciations. Now, something that's very important to draw attention to, something we do get questions about from time to time, is that OED's pattern of listing or before R variants, for example, is about lexicographical consistency. And like all variant pronunciations in OED, shouldn't be directly interpreted or interpreted in any way as an ordering by frequency or popularity. We do something similar with the the British English trans sequence. We present those in a fairly routine order that's not to do with frequency or popularity per se. So the strut vowel for the US English model is not as open or drop back as its British English counterpart, which led to Upton and Kretschmar's use of schwa here. And nurse words are shown with the unmarked quality of a stressed rhotic schwa. Vowel length, you might notice in the British English model, there was quite a few kind of length marks around the place, as in British English fleece. That's considered environmentally conditioned and not marked. Near and square words are shown only with a centralizing glide when the vowel falls in the final syllable of the entry. So this is where, for example, you'll find that there isn't a bracketed schwa in square dance or squaring, but there is one in over square. So that square at the final syllable will have that bracketed schwa. An equivalent approach is taken with the cure set. If we look at our weak form vowels at the rightmost column, the added and beautiful weak vowels are typically not as high as in British English. Added vowels, they tend towards the schwa, except for where the most recent preceding vowel ends high and front. So if it's following a word which has e, I, a, I, or oi. And in those cases, we might find that the ed ending is being pronounced with a more I quality, or a quality that's better represented by the barred. Now, the occurrence of the barred that we looked at in the British English is a lot less common in the US English. And words of the because set are given the extreme values, if you like, of the schwa and an e, so because and because. Obviously with a better stress pattern than I've just given there. But an intermediate quality close to an I sound is an often quite feasible unshown variant. Like the British, there are two nasalized vowel qualities for the American. It's for the US, it's just a mirroring of the British ones, just slightly different symbols. They're not shown in the table. The between vowel T is often realized as a voiced alveolar tap. When we noticed, we commented on this a couple of times already. Kretschmar discusses this in his 2008 Varieties of English chapter, meaning in the way that it results in the same forms for latter and ladder. And it's shown as the D letter. But this is also something that helps us to limit the range of additional symbols required to render the pronunciations. So there's kind of the two elements to why it's useful for us to show that as a D symbol rather than introducing a new symbol. Consonant clusters may be simplified to a greater extent than in British English. One example being how the T is bracketed in words such as hunter. So the American transcription feasibly offers hunter as well as hunter, but it wouldn't be the case in centile where the T is in a syllable with some degree of stress. And lastly, the US English preserves a stronger set of secondary stresses compared with the British English. So most syllables with full vowels will have at least a secondary stress mark. And of course, British and US Englishes are known for having a number of key differences in the preferred primary stress placement. Now, on our next slide, you can see our kind of summary of our world Englishes. And this is really...
I'm just going to, Matthew, sorry. And just before we move off this slide, I'm just going to butt in for a second and say, we've just noticed a typo, which is that the very first symbol for the kit vowel should not have a dot. Sorry, I wasn't sure if you'd spot it, but I thought I'd just interrupt you to make that correction before we go on to the next slide.
Thank you, Catherine. We will make sure that is corrected. Well spotted. Thank you for that. So we will move on to our world Englishes. And we mentioned earlier briefly how Upton and Kretschmar's vowel system has facilitated our expansion of pronunciations for other varieties of English. It isn't the focus of today's presentation, but to date, we do have 13 published varieties and more in the pipeline. Each of these varieties has its own symbol set. It has its own key to pronunciation, and it has its own pronunciation model. Upton and Kretschmar's different vowels for, say, the British and US trap, price, and goat vowels open the door for these to be quite detailed. Because of their approach, we're able to now represent much more of the phonetic quality differences between the vowels of each variety, as well as which varieties do or don't have dental fricatives or have different approaches to consonant cluster simplification or to stress patterning. So Catherine, some future directions.
Thank you. So one of the first things I'd like to talk, this is probably more current activity than future directions, but I'd like to direct everybody to take a look at the OED.com pages, where we have some new keys and some more discussion of the models as we've done today. That's now on our public web pages for people to explore. Some other good things that are worth having a look at there are, if you're a researcher interested in looking in using our data, either our pronunciation data or the dictionary data more widely for research, there's a lot of initiatives around our OED labs. You can access the data using APIs or different formats. So go and have a look at that if that's where your interests lie. There is more information to be found on the website also about the sound bank, which Matthew mentioned earlier. So in terms of pieces of work that we're doing or we're planning to do, there's just 3 things that I thought I'd take 3 minutes to mention, and then we will move on to the question section. Matthew mentioned earlier our work on affixes and combining forms. And that's one of the things we've been focused on recently. And what we've done there is, rather than giving a pronunciation at the top of an entry for a part of something that would be stuck together with another part to make a whole word, rather than giving the pronunciation there, we've been able to populate the sub-entries with pronunciations for all of the words which lie underneath, which is, the idea is to help the user so that they don't have to do a kind of jigsaw job to put those together. The second thing that we've worked on a lot recently, or our colleague Gary Lester particularly has worked on recently, is developing tools allowing us to search through the pronunciation data, through the transcriptions, and through the sound files, how they exist. So editors are able to look at what they've done, go and listen to a sound file to see if it's a perfect fit, if it's not, to make sure that we generate new recordings. And the way that the search tool has allowed us to look at the data more systematically means we can think about not only making fixes, but about starting to see the pronunciation information as a whole and think about structural changes that we might want to make. So it's not just sort of not just an exercise in smoothing things over or bringing them together, but actually looking at where we might take it in the future. And the last thing I wanted to mention, which is not just an OED thing, but an Oxford Languages thing in general, we've seen earlier how the transcription, so the slide I showed you much earlier where I had Mighty with how it was transcribed in NED and in the 2nd edition and then in the 3rd edition, you can see how they've varied over the history of OED. There's also a lot of variation between dictionaries. So Oxford University Press publishes a lot of ELT dictionaries aimed at learners. And so there's differences in the choice of symbols used for the transcription of pronunciation, even within our press, and certainly from one dictionary to another outside of there. So the thought kind of came to us that it would be wonderful to have a master form of a pronunciation transcription from which all of these and any future ideas for transcription could be generated. So it can move us beyond disagreements that might exist about choices of symbol, because we could easily generate one from the master form. We could easily generate lots of them. So I think I'm going to try and show you a little animation here, which, yes, it's working on my screen anyway. I hope it's working in yours. So as this does its thing, I'm going to tell you what you're looking at. I'll explain the name first. So as I say, if only we had one master form. Optra stands for one pronunciation to rule them all, in a fine tradition of silly names for great things. So what this is the super specified pronunciation from which we can generate a D view, which is what the video is showing you now. There's the British and American, the advanced dictionary view. So as used in ELT, you can see differences, and then amplification is here as well. I could watch that all day, but I'm going to stop, and we can move into some questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sangster and Dr. Morland, for a very interesting presentation. I enjoyed it very much. So we start the Q&A session now. We've already got a few questions. So Catherine, it's over to you again.
Yes. So we were asked, what principles does the routine ordering of pronunciation variants follow? So that would be when we have an entry with more than one pronunciation. So as with the, I had zoophile earlier. That's a very good question. It's one of those things that I wish very much there was a huge corpus of quantitative data on which we could say, we give this one first because it is the most common. And that is the principle that underpins the ordering of other things in OED. So for instance, whether we have with variant spellings, which one is chosen to be the head word spelling and which ones are the variants, that's very much based on quantifiable corpus data and lots of analysis. We don't have that privilege in sort of pronunciation world. So when we order them, it is rather subjective. There's an editorial judgment about which pronunciation is more common. We're not trying to imply any kind of recommendation by the one that we put first. That's certainly something to emphasize. Other than that, yes, we would try and look, and sometimes it's very clear. Sometimes you can say, well, really, this pronunciation is falling out of use. This is vastly the more common one, but the other one still persists to the point where we still would want to have it. And then we would put them both, and you would put the minority pronunciation second. But in other cases, it's really quite, it seems pretty evenly balanced, and it is rather subjective. I don't know, Matthew, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think that you've said it all, Catherine. I think the key thing is, we do have these systematic variants, as we mentioned, with thought and in the US, for example, or the ah in the British. We try not to introduce things that would look inconsistent. So as I mentioned, for example, if you've got trans entries, then we do try not to kind of have it randomly being one is tra and one is tra at the first up. So we try and make sure there's some sort of consistency there. As Catherine says, we do try to at least make sure that the very uncommon ones are not the top, but it is a subjective judgment. Sometimes there are some resources that we have that might enable us to get a very brief overview as to what how speakers are using a particular word and which one might be slightly more or less common. But yes, it would be lovely to have a nice big corpus. So if anyone listening and watching today has a particular burning desire to put together a massive corpus of all these lovely audio files that of people using terms, please let us know.
Yes, so the next question, I'm literally reading these and then answering them. So Lynn Murphy asks, the choice to represent American flaps as with the D symbol seems very oriented to a non-American audience, since American dictionaries generally use T. Can you say a bit more about the role of the imagined audience in making decisions about how to represent pronunciations, as well as which pronunciations are included? Yes, I could say a lot about that. I mean, one thing to say is that the Optra tool that the tool that I showed you at the very end there would give us the scope to say it would give us the scope to choose a different symbol. So our ELT dictionaries represent the flat T as a T with a little subscript V to indicate an element of voicing, and just as we could use the super specified pronunciation to generate one or other of those. If we made a decision to use a new symbol, then we're moving towards a position where we would be very able to transform them as we might wish. I would say that the imagined audience, I think we would hope that the dictionary is globally accessible, and it's interesting to note that that seems like something that's skewed away from an American audience. So I'll give that some more thought. Don't know, Matthew, do you have any further thoughts on that one?
No, I think Catherine, you covered it. I mean, as I say, there were obviously two original thoughts that we could pick up from what Kretschmar's written about that particular topic. One being the similarity in subjective terms between the kind of the latter ladder pairing, but also obviously from a lexicographical point of view, the idea of not introducing new symbols is something that we've butted up against elsewhere, not wanting to introduce extra kind of things to have to explain and include beyond what we need to. So you'll notice that some of the vowel qualities, for example, we've thought long and hard about whether we would introduce some of the vowel qualities, the extra ones that we now use. So it is something we will absolutely be reflecting on and looking at as we go forwards, as the demands of and the way in which the OED is being used, of course, as that's changing. We're constantly looking to see how we can revise this. So yeah.
The next question is about, it picks up on the slide that suggests the framework of an Irish pronunciation, and the questioner says, how can this be, given that pronunciations by educated Irish speakers differ so radically? Yes, they certainly do. If you want to know more about the specific models for the world Englishes, if you go to the website, for each of the models, there's a key and a model page which explains what choices we've made, and what the sources, what we've based those choices on. So Matthew, do you want to say a little more? You've done a lot of the work on those. Do you want to say a little more about that?
Yeah, sure. The Irish in particular is a variety. What we've chosen to go with for that is what's known as Hiberno English, and it's based on the work of Hickey, and in the main with some kind of adaptations for the OED purposes. So it does focus. The variety is based on a kind of a middle class Dublin English during the early and mid 20th century. That's kind of how it formed the basis of our Irish English model. But of course, we do try and consider, for example, if something is an Irish English in very loose terms, in the sense that it's kind of, particularly if it's Ulster, then we will try and use the Irish English model. We've deliberately made it flexible enough so that we can represent, say, more Ulster English sounding pronunciations. So where possible and where it's important that we're representing a word which is a specific part of Ireland, or indeed other parts of the world. This is a question that comes up again with the Caribbean, which we get a lot of questions about, and certainly when we released that model. So, huge variation across the Caribbean. We have deliberately taken our time to make a model that is meaningful, and so it's still going to be of value to users to see a Caribbean pronunciation, but it's flexible enough for us to be able to, say, give a slightly more Jamaican flavored pronunciation for a word which is specifically Jamaican, or a Trinidadian one. And so that's where kind of we can't just simply say that our models are based on one resource. We have a starting point, and then we build it into as flexible as a resource as we need. I hope I've actually answered that question, Catherine.
Yes, I think so. There's lots of good ones. We're not going to get through them all, but I'm going to have a little, let me see. So there is a question from Michael Everson about, he says, one of the problems with the British English model is that there are many rhotic accents in European English. Yes, there are. The phonemic representation of these is one biased towards Southern English dialects, which is rather problematic. I'm hoping that we'll have the scope. Yes, I agree. I don't know, and sorry, you end by saying more specific guidance from the OED itself for British rhotic forms would be welcome. That's interesting. I'm going to sort of take that away and think about that. Thank you. And the same questioner adds that he doesn't think that shrew and shwee and beautiful and because are formally sanctioned by the IPA, but they ought to be. More of a compliment question. see. There's a question about the phenomenon of standard pronunciation. I would have to know a bit more about what you meant by standard pronunciation. I think you said people from different linguistic backgrounds cannot follow British or American models accurately. I think I need to know more about what you meant by standard pronunciation to respond to that. The next question, a great one. You yourself pronounced, I'm not sure which of us it was, but it's probably both of us, pronounced near as a long monophthong, as do many or even speakers of SSBE. Why not transcribe it as such? No, well, because that's not what the model currently does. We've looked at the ways that we can introduce flexibility and a possibility for future change into the model, but at the moment we are sticking with that way of transcribing it. We have all been reading with interest the Matthew, I've gone blank on the author, but the Beyond RP book.
Yes, and I've done likewise. Oh my goodness,
Lindsay,
yes. Thank you. Yes,
Lindsay.
well done.
Yes, that's been a really
Thank you.
So do you want, I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, Matthew, or I think I've answered the question.
I think so. It's certainly the case that the changes to near are not quite as kind of established quite yet as the changes that have happened to square. So square, we're not the only resource nowadays that is considering square in that monophthongal way. There are a number of pronunciation guides and expert sources that do that, even though certainly the prevalence and the preference still in ELT, English language teaching resources, is still majority at the moment still towards the diphthongal transcription. But certainly we've got the, we're satisfied to follow Upton's lead with representing that with the monophthong. But certainly, yes, the near's not quite there yet, but I have a sneaking suspicion that questioner is onto something there, with that being a future thing we'll be looking at.
Great. The next question was a request for the source of the Daniel Jones quotes, and I'm pretty sure they're all from the introduction of his 1917 dictionary. We'll
right.
put the referencing when we write up the questions for that to search it afterwards. We'll make sure we give you the full source there.
Yes, the 1917 is very difficult to get hold of. I will warn anyone that's trying to do that. But there are, it's a wonderful read if you can get hold of it. And just as James Murray's preface, which you can read about James Murray's preface to the to what we consider, the NED. That's that you can read that on the OED website, and it's certainly worth it's beautiful the way that they considered pronunciations back then.
The next question, I definitely want to answer that. Well, actually, Matthew, I'm going to let you take it a little bit, but the question is, it was intriguing not to find Indian English among the world varieties listed. Why is the OED not studying this variety, considering the numbers of speakers? Right. Well, you'll be glad to know that we have been studying this variety for several years now, and it is not currently a model that we have that is included in the World English pronunciations that's provided, but it's something that we've looked at for some time, and we're very keen to move forward with it. Do you want to say more, Matthew?
Yeah, I think so. So yes, thanks, Catherine. Yeah, it is something that we've spent a large amount of time looking at. So please don't be under the impression that it's not something that we are looking into. We've consulted a number of experts on this topic and read as much as we can. One of the biggest challenges with putting together an Indian English model has been that there is so much that is dependent on the first language, and obviously every area of India has its own kind of first language and first language influences. So the sorts of things that we were able to find that people were doing made it very difficult to create a broad Indian English model. There's certainly no Indian equivalent of RP, for example, that we could that we could look to. So it is something we're looking at. It's something that I'm sure we will find a solution to, but it's just exactly how we get there is something that's just taking longer than it has done for some of our other varieties.
So the next question is from Rod Temple. She says, I appreciate not aiming for comprehensive history of the pronunciation of any entry, but when pronunciations are updated to be contemporary, are you archiving previous versions? Yes and no. If they, as we showed, if there was a difference that seems to be significant or substantial, then the change is noted in it with the comment, with the revision file comment, which gives the NED pronunciation. But where there's a change, perhaps between a more recent one and then the present day one, if it was a big change, then certainly yes, it would be commented on. But if it was a fix or a small change, it could be accessed by looking at the version histories. We can sort of pinpoint places where changes have been made in certain tagged sections. So there would probably be a way to look at that systematically, kind of under the bonnet. But there isn't an archive that's brought to the surface, if that makes sense. Lots more questions. How many phonemes are there in British English? And now, Matthew, is this the opportunity for a fun fact?
Oh, well, actually, it's not one of my fun facts, actually, but as far as well, we can be, it can be. So what we don't regard triphthongs, for example, as separate phonemes, so the ire and our and aya as in player. But so just regarding it amongst the phonemes, we've got, like I say, we've got a 26 base consonant set for British English. So that's if you pick up any text on English pronunciation, British English pronunciation in particular, you'll see it's likely to say 24. But we add to that the velar fricative as used in loch, and we also recognise the Welsh double L, if you like, the alveolar lateral fricative. So that's 26 consonants, and in terms of phonemes, it's difficult with the vowels to an extent. Generally speaking, we'll say that it's 20, but obviously to that we add the barred I and the barred U. So that's remembering that those are not phonemes in themselves; they're representing that it could be more of a schwa-like quality or more of a slightly more peripheral quality. So we've got those, and of course we've got our nasalized vowels as well, our 2 for that.
Thank you. I'm going to squeeze 2 more quick ones in, and then I know there are a couple we haven't been able to respond to, but we will afterwards. So one questioner asks, on what principles do you transcribe words of foreign origin? That's not, but firstly, we don't give transcriptions in languages of origin. All of our transcriptions are for English, whether British or US or another world English. We give only those transcriptions. We never give, as it were, native language transcriptions as well. And so the question really is if a word is present or added to OED, then we transcribe it. So the choice for inclusion of words of foreign origin is not ours. As soon as a word is deemed to have been adopted into English by our editorial colleagues, then we get to work. So it's not our call. And another questioner asks, do you envisage a time when the TH sounds, the spelled TH, become transcribed as F and V with the F and V letters? At what point would this happen? That sort of comes back to what we were talking about earlier about having a written symbol which can be realized in different ways by different speakers. I think at the moment, F and V sit under realizations of that phoneme F, but of course they're also separate phonemes in their own right. I don't think it's anything that OED will be doing imminently. Otherwise, I think it's just a matter of keeping. We want to describe what's being used, so it would be a matter of us or the people who replace us in the future keeping their ears to the ground about it. I don't know. What do you think, Matthew?
I think you're right, Catherine. I think that it's certainly within the parameters of the variety that we're representing at the moment. It is something that some people are something perhaps was a bit more restricted in use, certainly away from Jones's public school pronunciation and that sort of thing. But no, I think that it may well be something that evolves in that way. It'd be fascinating to see if it does, if they creep in as variants. I think that'd be the way it would happen first, is that they would potentially creep in as variants, and then but at the moment, the TH sound, the dental fricatives are still very much alive and well. So hopefully they'll continue for a lot longer.
Thank you. I think that we had better wind it up. Thank you very much to Simone for all of her support, and Thais as well, in making it happen. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody I can see people have stayed loyally to the end, and everyone who's asked such brilliant questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to the presenters again. It was really interesting, and thank you very much everyone who attended. So as I mentioned before, we didn't have time to go through all the questions, so my apologies for those who sent in questions, but they will be passed on to the panelists, and as soon as the recording is prepared and posted for viewing, we'll post the questions there as well. So thanks again. I hope you enjoyed this. And from us for now, goodbye.